Hello and welcome to In Focus. I'm G. Sampath. The government has announced that it's going to include questions on caste in the next population census that is due now. And this has raised a lot of questions because this very regime has been against holding a caste census for the longest time, whereas the opposition has been demanding a caste census, has made it an election plank issue as well. The BJP had responded with slogans like, "Katenge to batenge" and all those kinds of how it could be a divisive kind of an issue. But now there has been this U-turn with the ruling party, and everybody is now talking about the various aspects of this caste census. What does it actually mean? How is this caste census going to be different from the last such exercise, which was carried out on a national scale, which was in 1931 by the British? How do you ensure the integrity of the data that is going to be collected? And what are the implications? What happens after the caste census? Is it only about reservations? Are there going to be any deeper changes in policy orientations? Or is it going to be, how is it going to impact, for example, the entire debate on EWS quotas, the creamy layers, and all those other kinds of things as well? We're going to be talking about all these issues around the caste census, how it's going to be implemented, and all the various debates around it, the political churn that it could create, and all those various aspects. And joining us today, we have the well-known sociologist, Professor Satish Deshpande. Dr. Deshpande, welcome to the pod.
Thank you.
Right. To start with, I was going to ask you, the last time this kind of an exercise was done was in 1931, which was done by the British, and they have been doing it regularly since 1881. But the Indian government, after we got independence, India stopped doing this entire exercise. We do the census. We have been doing since at least the COVID happened. So why did India stop the caste census after getting independence? Was it the instinct for self-preservation of the elite, or is that too unfair to sort of put that kind of an interpretation on this entire avoidance of a census of this kind?
Yes, I think it would be perhaps a little bit unfair to say from our retrospective vantage point that it was at least a conscious instinct for self preservation of the elite. But looking at it in retrospect, we need to understand that the moment of independence was a hegemonic moment. That is to say, it was a moment for the ideological moral victory of the Indian freedom movement. And the Indian freedom movement at that time was led almost entirely by upper caste people. And yet it had managed to, in a sense, domesticate or take care of the caste problem to provide some kind of a united front. Of course, it was not fully united. We had partition, we had all those things. But on the whole, the movement against the British served to underplay the caste question. So this was, in a sense, objectively speaking, yes, since independence was going to be at that moment a transfer of power from one elite to another, a transfer of power from a British elite to a local or indigenous elite, but an elite nevertheless. This aspect got sort of hidden by the fact that the caste census was stopped. There had been a lot of agitation around the caste census, particularly the nationalist movement felt that the caste census was a British ploy to divide the Indian people and so on. And therefore, it is understandable that the Indian government, in the Nehru government, decided not to have the caste census. So while in an objective sense, it was in the interests of the elite, to say that this was done consciously at that time may be an exaggeration. It had the effect of protecting the interests of the elite. But what it did to my mind, much more fundamentally, it cemented a view of caste where caste was seen as essentially a problem of the lower castes. In fact, the problem of caste was seen as the problem that the lower castes were a problem. Now, to some extent, untouchability issue brought out
Is that the
more.
reason why? Is that the reason why the government has continued to count caste, but only of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, of not any,
Yes,
not the
yes,
other?
yes, because our constitution is a peculiar, it is a peculiar compromise. On the one hand, it seems to abolish caste and de-recognizes caste in every legal sense. On the other hand, because of our history, undeniable history, it is forced to recognize caste in the form of the scheduled tribes and scheduled castes, and in the form of the abolition of something called untouchability, which is never defined in the constitution but is nevertheless singled out for abolition and in a legal sense.
Even caste as such is not defined in the
No,
constitution. Is that right?
it is not defined, but the for example, the schedules which make up the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, these were drawn up in 1935, in actually pre-independence. So after 1950, we have adopted them more or less word for word, those schedules. The list is a legal entity. So the list consists of a number of caste names. Now, who gets to be in that caste is again, in a legal sense, a matter of individual certificates that individuals may possess. But the actual question of what is the scheduled caste, what are the scheduled tribes, very roughly at that time, this was largely based on the 31 census. At that, I'm talking about the 1935 Act. It was basically the bottom sections of society were chosen. And this choice involved, in a country the size of India, obviously a lot of variation. So in some regions, particular castes chosen to be under the scheduled caste, for example, were not strictly untouchable, but they were at the bottom of the caste structure. In other places, they were not just untouchable, but there was even shadow untouchability and distance untouchability and things like that. So in short, there was a lot of variation, but the best that could be done in terms of protecting the rights of a group, that a very large group that would otherwise be excluded from society if society were left alone, the recognition of this was carried out through the creation of these schedules. So it was an messy, quick sort of thing that had to be done, but it has endured. It has proved to be. It has done its job. So on the one hand, we abolish caste. On the other hand, we recognize that certain groups have had the disadvantage of caste. In doing all this, we are encouraged by our constitution and by the dominant thinking at that time, which is mainly led by the upper caste, that caste is now a problem of our past. That independent India is, in a sense, left caste behind. And yes, we have reservation and so on, but that is a regrettable exception to the otherwise rule that we have left caste behind. We make this declaration in terms of the institution of caste without doing anything to undermine the material basis of caste. That is to say, the reproduction of inequalities of wealth and property and so on. Nothing much was done with them about them. So, on the one hand, we banned caste in terms of talk about it as an institution, and on the other hand, we allowed that institution to flourish in terms of its fundamentals, in terms of whatever made caste able to reproduce itself as a system of inequality, hierarchical system of inequality. So we have been living this contradiction ever since. On the one hand, we believe that caste should have no place in public life. On the other hand, we have constant recurrence of discrimination, atrocities, things like that, where particular castes have to be protected. But in all of this, our view of caste becomes truncated. We think of caste as though it were limited to just lower castes. Whereas caste is a relational thing, and you have to look at it relationally. You can't have the disprivilege of the so called lower castes without simultaneously looking at the privilege of the upper castes. And that our system has never done. Our system has always looked at the problem as though it were a problem of the lower end. What it can do to, in a sense, curb the power or privilege of the upper end has never seriously been looked at.
Right. So, and thank you for pointing out this entire dichotomy in the way we have looked at caste, especially the establishment, the political system. On the one hand, there is this framing of caste as some kind of a problem of the quote unquote lower caste because they have been marginalized and they are these marginalized communities who need welfare benefits, and for that purpose alone, you need to enumerate them, etc., etc. And if you sort of move away from them, there is no problem. Caste is anyway supposed to be abolished. So where do we why do we need to do any kind of a caste census? Because census by definition has to be enumeration of the entire whole, not just one particular section. And as you correctly pointed out, you cannot have disprivilege in a society or in a country without it being a symptom of a privilege in some other section of the same society. Now, this kind of a caste enumeration we have not done since independence, and you pointed out how the entire narrative of it being a ploy by the British was one of the reasons. Now, we did have a socioeconomic caste census in 2011, but the caste data was never made public. So, how do you view this SECC exercise? What I mean, I believe we came up with some 46 lakh caste names or something, ridiculous like that. So, what lessons do you think we should be drawing from the 2011 caste census exercise as we now move towards a proper caste census, which is going to be conducted across the country, the full population?
Right. I have very strong views on the SECC of 2011. I believe we should not learn any lesson from it. I believe that it was a project designed to fail. That it was, in a sense, a compromise. The government very reluctantly gave in to the demand for a caste census and did its best to, in a sense, ensure that it doesn't actually happen, though the government may be seen to. So, the simple way to put it is that there is only one organization. We must remember that the Indian census is the largest such exercise in human history. Every Indian census, because our population is still growing, is the largest such exercise ever done anywhere in the world. So
It
it's
is.
not an easy.
I think there are two unique aspects. One, it is the largest such exercise, and secondly, nobody. I think no other country has ever had to count caste or something equivalent of caste in this fashion.
Yes, but what I'm saying is that because it's such a gigantic and complicated exercise, there is only one part of the state machinery that is able to do this, that has done it in the past, and that is the Registrar General's office, the Census Office. The moment the SECC was entrusted to the Rural Development Ministry, we knew it would fail because the enormous logistical planning that is needed to ensure this. The 2001 census, if I remember correctly, needed some 2 million enumerators. So we're talking about a huge exercise. So what I'm saying is that the SECC we should simply forget about because it was made to fail. And its failure was more or less ensured in the way that the decision was implemented. And these figures of 46 lakh castes coming up and so on is simply bad handling of the survey. uh, People don't realize that more than 1,000 religions are enumerated, and many thousands, 17 between 17 and 19,000 languages are enumerated, and tens of thousands of occupations are enumerated. That is to say, respondents give you, if you list simply the occupation that people give you, each person may have, the average poor person in India would have 5 6 occupations because they can't make their living doing just one thing. So the recording of occupation is the single most complicated thing the census does, but it has done so successfully over a long period of time. So in a country of 1.4 billion, large numbers is the rule, it is not the exception. The question is, can we deal with them in a logical manner to turn it into usable information? The short answer is yes, we can. Or rather, the census mechanism, the census apparatus, RG office can do that. So if you entrust, in fact, in 2001, the then Census Commissioner, M. Vijayanunni, Registrar General of India, said that they were ready to perform the caste census, that they had prepared for it. It's just that the government had to make a decision. And the government, as so many other times as well, it did not decide. So the logistical problems of the caste census are formidable, but they are not unsolvable. We can produce usable data, as has been shown by Bihar, as has been shown by Karnataka, and so on, when state census-like surveys have been done.
Right. So, so thank you for sort of establishing very clearly that the SEC was, set up to fail, and we don't need to be drawing any lessons from it. But again, coming back to the entire process, you did mention that in 2001, the Registrar General was ready for it. Now, I was just curious, now we know, for instance, if you look at the actual lists, the center maintains a consolidated list of OBCs, but each state government has its own list of various castes which are different. So how do we go ahead with this kind of an exercise? Should they simply merge all the state lists with the central list, which has some 2,650 communities of OBCs, or should there, because these are also politically loaded questions when you make a decision to include or not include? Do you have a drop down menu? How many caste should be included in the drop down menu, or should we just let people name their own caste, in which case if you end up with like an unbelievable number, how do you then go about collating them?
I think this can be done and has been done. As I pointed out, there are similar analogous sort of types of data that the census collects. I think we need both kinds of lists. We need state lists and we need central lists. And these can be, lists are a downstream process. The process of the census is actually counting particular castes. And when we talk about a caste census, we are not talking about the counting of categories. Categories, again, are downstream things. They are made up of components that are castes. The census is a process of counting the components themselves. That is, it is counting the basic fundamental unit, which is the castes. That is why it is important. How we add up, classify castes, that is a subsequent matter. And we can have a discussion on it. It can be done in a logical manner through discussion and so on. What cannot be done is the collection of the primary data. You can't, without the primary data, you can't have any downstream process at all. So I would feel that the downstream processes can be matters of rational debate.
So
And
when
we
you
need,
say caste versus category, you would say, caste would be like Yadavs and Brahmins and so on. Categories would be
yes,
OBCs,
yes,
SCs, etc.
yeah, yes.
Okay.
So this, in our country, this becomes in part a legal question. For example, the list of scheduled castes is written into a constitution. It cannot be changed except by parliament and therefore and by the president and so on. But there are other ways in which it is a political question. So there is a legal and a political angle to what categories are created out of caste names. And that is more or less a transparent thing in the sense that we see what is going on. What we don't see, and but which is why the census is very important. You see how our discussion again has got centered on the reserved categories or the lower caste categories. The most important data to my mind that this caste census, if it ever happens, that comes out, will be the data on the upper castes who have never been counted. After 1931, they have never been counted. So when we start looking at everybody's caste, and we start looking at caste as something that everybody has, no matter what their personal attitude towards it, then we begin to have a new way of looking at caste. That's what the caste census is important for. Yes, we can have lots of debate and lots of controversy about whether this caste should be in this category, that category, and so on. But to my mind, those are all transparent issues. They are matters of political pressure, counter pressure, and so on. And we can see what is going on when this is happening. What gets concealed when only such counting of castes is taken up only in the context of possible welfare schemes or possible reservation and so on, is you forget the other half, the other part of the equation, where so much privilege is being accumulated without visible intervention of the state. But the rich in any country, the rich get rich over time with the help of the state, no matter whether it's a what kind of economy it calls itself. So that is invisible to us, right? Because it's not, there's no explicit process of reservation and so on. It's only economists and journalists like yourself who will study the structure of subsidies, will find out the uncollected taxes, the kind of subsidies that go to the corporate sector, etc., etc., to find out the role that the state is playing in supporting wealth and privilege. So the census is important because it's a universal exercise. It will be difficult to present the census as simply yet another thing for the lower castes, a welfare program, a manrega, or a reservation or something like that. We will need to begin to talk about both ends of the spectrum at once.
Right.
Our
Now,
problem with caste, never been able to do that.
Dr. Deshpande, speaking of both ends of the spectrum, now if I mean just taking a quick look at the caste surveys that have been done at the state level,
Yes.
Bihar, Telangana, and Karnataka, and you did mention that the upper castes have never been properly counted. I think they were counted in 1931, but it was up to the Brahmins, for instance, to say whether they want to be counted or not. I think it was left. It wasn't really. Is that right? I mean, it wasn't really.
No. In one sense, it was up to anyone to say that there are no caste.
Okay.
And in every census, some fraction of 1% of the a small fraction, second decimal place fraction, returned themselves as no caste. So that option was available.
Okay.
Uh, it has always been available, and it will. I'm sure it will be. It should be available as well in any census that happens.
Wouldn't that result in undercounting or wrong counts?
No, no. When when you look at the numbers, you will see that the fraction that says they have no caste is very, very minuscule. Plus, when you look at their other data, that is to say their educational other data, you know immediately what caste they probably belong to, even if they wish to dissociate themselves from the caste. So it should be, one should be able to understand that it is only for the upper caste. The choice of being casteless is available only to the upper caste. To the rest of society, to the so-called lower caste, society will remind you every day what caste you are. If you pretend, if you say that from tomorrow I don't believe I belong to the scheduled caste, the rest of society will remind you that you're a scheduled caste person. Just like
Right.
if a woman or somebody who is not not in power says that we are now we are just the same as anyone, we are not powerless, society will remind them that they are. So I'm saying that that is not a problem. That option should
Okay.
be available. It will not result in any significant undercounting and so on. In fact, we can name a new caste of the casteless. We can say that those who, I belong to those who say, if you remember, there was this campaign for Meri Jati Hindustani that was started in one of the census years. So yeah, you can have that, but in numerical terms, it will be minuscule.
Right. So coming back to this question of the state level caste surveys,
Yeah.
I was just wondering if the current estimate for OBCs in India is it's a projection from 1931. It's around 52%, but in the three caste surveys that we have seen so far, in Bihar, if you look at it, the OBCs were 63%, which includes OBCs plus EBCs, and the OBCs are 56% in Telangana, and there were 70% in Karnataka. So, do you think with the new caste census, the first in nearly 100 years, we might run a chance that the percentage of the upper caste especially would be much lower than what we generally consider or estimate them to be, and the percentage of the OBCs could be much higher than what we generally take them to be?
Yes, this is very likely, and there are good demographic reasons for this, because by and large, birth rates are inversely related to prosperity. The more prosperous a community is, the lower is its net reproduction rate. That is, it you tend to have fewer children once you become um, sort of better off. So, broadly speaking, if the lower castes are poorer than the upper castes, you would expect them to have a higher rate of reproduction, higher fertility rate. Therefore, you would expect them as a proportion to increase over time. Now, this is speaking in very simple, broad terms. In every caste group in India today, we have deep differentiation. So, within a given caste group, there will be rich and poor, and they will be reproducing roughly at different rates. Broadly speaking, this is true. There are always exceptions. So, there are reasons to believe why this should be so.
Right. So, and there are also a lot of this regional and linguistic diversity in caste names, and people are talking about this whole code directory for use in the
Yes.
census. So, how does this actually work? I mean, is there an academically rigorous way for us to sort of figure this out so that there isn't overlap and merging of,
Yes.
the wrong categories of caste names and so on?
Yes, there is a way of doing this. Again, analogously, the same way it is done for languages or
Hmm.
for religions or for occupations. In the rational, what is called rationalization. Usually, committees are set up for this, consisting of experts who. So with this new technology available for data processing today, we are in a much better position to have a kind of from the unit level data you can have seamless aggregation and disaggregation. You can store the entire unit level data and it is accessible to you. And today you decide you want to add caste A, B, and C into
There are
category X.
also
You
subcastes
can
and
change it. Yeah.
sub-subcastes.
Yeah, all of that. So there is some scholarship available by region, locality, and so on as to which castes are where and synonyms for caste. The People of India project in the early 80s had in the mid 80s had produced a whole compendium of caste names across the country and so on. So it has to be done in a disaggregated manner. You will have to do it region by region. Within each state also, you'll have to look at regions and so on. And there will be social scientists who have worked on those regions who can give you, plus past experience. There's a lot of expertise available within the census apparatus itself, local school teachers and so on, who can also tell us which castes are in which found predominantly in which localities, and synonyms, so that you can have disambiguation, or you can have a set of synonyms for various castes. So it's a very tedious, very long, very painstaking exercise, but there is nothing impossible about it.
Right, right. And another big question which keeps coming up is how would religion fit into this matrix? Would we be counting castes of, because even, I mean, it's clearly present across religion. There are Christians who identify with certain castes. Similarly with Muslims as well. So would their castes also be counted, or will it be sort of restricted to the
So,
Hindus?
no, the religion information will be as a qualifier for the caste. For example, the Bihar caste survey has counted the caste of everybody. So you have a halal khor Muslim, in brackets they'll be written Muslim, right? So or some other caste, even in the so-called general category, there are Muslims who are counted as Ashraf, the Ashraf castes. So that is not a problem. And in our country, everybody knows their caste. There's no problem with that.
Right. So, what happens once we have the caste census data with us, and is it going to be used only for expanding reservations, removing the 51% cap, which the Congress is already demanding? The Supreme Court mandated
Yes,
cap that should be sort of removed. And generally people tend to talk about better targeting of welfare schemes and handouts and so on.
right.
You made a very important point earlier where he said for the first time you're going to be shifting the gaze also to the other side, the upper caste. So that makes me wonder, is there a different way of imagining social justice measures? For instance, one of the big factors for the upper caste historically has been land. I mean, and you have explained in other interviews where intergenerational, assets have been a key in terms of accumulating privilege and social capital. So, would, for instance, land redistribution, for example, and giving assets to those who have not had assets for generations, would that be like land reform be one of the planks for a more positive social transformation initiative from the government? Would that be something that we could be looking at, or is it going to be only talk of reservations and private sector, etc., etc.?
To begin with, given the way the discourse is framed already, it will take time to change the parameters. So, yes, in the beginning, the discussion will all be about expanding reservation and squabbling about this group is getting so much, this that group is getting so. But the exercise of the census, once everybody's caste is out there, for example, the Bihar caste survey, It shows you the position of the extreme gulf between, say, the castes and almost everybody else. So when this kind of gulf becomes visible, remember that the census, one of the important aspects about the census is that it is going to be public. There are no other sources of a collective portrait of the nation that can be produced in this way. Sample surveys always have a problem because you can say that it's based on a sample and there is always a margin of error. Uh, there are many entities today which have access to such a macro picture. For example, big data owned by big corporates like Google and so on. But it is not public, and it is proprietary information. It is in fact used to generate more revenue for these companies and so on. The very important part about the census is that it will make a self portrait of the nation. I like to think of the census as I know that apparently Rahul Gandhi has called it an X-ray, but I like to think of it more as a kind of collective selfie of the nation, and it will be available to all of us to look at, hopefully, if the government does not suppress the data.
Right. Now, speaking of these fears, I mean, it's interesting that there is, you sort of articulated this fear of the government suppressing the data. Another related fear which has been expressed is also, how do you, I mean, there is a lot of track record in the public domain about the current government's relationship with data in general, other kinds of surveys, how they have been either released or suppressed, etc., etc. So, how do we ensure the integrity of the data that is collected? That it is robust. There is no fudging. Is there certain guardrails that you think can be sort of expected or demanded for the process that so that the data is robust and it's clean?
Yeah, well, I've been working with data for a long time, and so have a large community of social scientists. And as you are probably aware, in the last decade or decade and a half, there have been unprecedented concerns about the data ecosystem in India. We have had one of the best data ecosystems in the world, quite exceptional, actually. And its reputation is now at stake because of various decisions and various forms of intervention that have been carried out. So there is no answer to that except to say that there must be public pressure on this. And perhaps we can only hope that the census data is different from, say, GDP data. For that matter, GDP data also belongs to the public, right? It's after all, the GDP is basically the GDP of the public, in a sense, of the country. But since the census is perhaps, at least in public perception, a less technical affair, more of a social thing. Perhaps the pressure to keep it transparent will be more. In fact, the decision to hold, or at least the announcement of a decision to hold the census, is itself a concession to pressure. And so we must be optimistic about the effects of such pressure. But that is the only thing I can think of. Public pressure is the only thing that the government will take in account in ensuring that the data collection is
No, you
not.
you made you made this distinction between, say, something like GDP data or per capita, poverty line, etc., etc., which are a bit technical. You infer those data points from other primary data, so there might be scope for fudging or manipulation there. But this is a far more simple process. So
Yes.
do you still think it is possible to fudge this data at all? Because you're just collecting numbers, right? So, or is it like, shouldn't it be more difficult to fudge data here at all?
Well, from an academic point of view, if you get into the details, there have been academic studies on this. If you get into the details of what happens, a lot of many actors play a role in the production of what ultimately turns up as data. One of the most important of these actors is the enumerator. And quite independently of any government biases or ideologies and so on, enumerators are also social people. They live in society. They are the school teachers and so on, and their beliefs about things like caste and and religion and so on uh, often tend to play a significant role in how the census is actually carried out. But the good thing about the census is that it's such a gigantic exercise that you can have some hope of the mutual cancellation of errors or biases, so that what is produced in the end, it is very hard to bias an exercise on the scale of a census unless you there is a like a war, like, effort, that goes into it. The government has to really mobilize on a very on a war footing to ensure that its exercise the size of a census produces some predetermined result. It's very difficult to do, which doesn't mean that the government may not try. I mean, past experience tells us that it's not beyond the pale for it to try to do so. But in my opinion, it will be very difficult and counterproductive to try to do that kind of thing, where, as you say, the technicalities are at least seen as being less relevant.
Also, this enumeration is going to be electronic, right? It's not going to be paper and pen and paper. So would that sort of give more scope for?
No, electronic data collection gives more scope for, uh,
That's
because
what I'm
your
asking.
your
Doesn't it
your
give more scope for for
your
doctoring?
manipulation is invisible.
Yes.
Otherwise, there's always this piece of paper that somebody has written down, and there's
Right.
always the risk that that piece of paper will come to light at some point. But
Right.
with data, it is gone. I mean, once you like, so the risks with electronics are much more, to my mind. But let's think positively. Let's be optimistic, and the very concession to, think of having a census is itself a big step. And if that can be achieved, then surely the exercise itself. And remember that our politics is a very complicated, sort of a stage where there are lots of things happening, and there may be completely extraneous reasons for which a caste census may suddenly become, something that is strategic for the government of the day to do. So we can also bank on those things, those contingent factors, unrelated to the census as such, which can result in it happening. But what cannot be denied is that there is now a change of dominant opinion about things like the caste census. I have been talking on this issue for more than 25 years, and I can tell you that in past 6, 7, 8 years there has been a distinct change. And even in the attitude of the Congress itself, there has been a U-turn. If we are talking about the BJP U-turn today, we must also talk about the Congress U-turn, which happened, some years ago. Because before that, the Congress also was, at least the top leadership of the Congress was also not particularly interested in a caste census. In fact, was rather, sort of unhospitable to the idea. So things are changing, and that should be, we should take that as a sign of hope.
Right. I mean, speaking of the politics of the caste census, I mean, you did mention about the Congress's U-turn, and also the BJP's U-turn is, of course, far more pronounced. I
Spectacular,
just
yes.
wanted to sort of ask you about this BJP's U-turn. I mean, one could imagine that it might make sense for a political party to sort of change its stance on the caste census because there are elections coming up, and it is part of the electoral calculus. You can understand, but how does it really make any kind of sense for the RSS to be on board with this? Because it directly militates against everything the RSS stands for. I mean, the entire caste census is it's sort of diametrically opposed to its vision of a Hindu Rashtra where all Hindus are equal. And you're not going to be talking about, various other sub identities as Hindus. So, how do you think the RSS is going to be aligned with this kind of a position?
I don't think the RSS says that all Hindus are equal. It says
Okay.
that they're all Hindus, and
Right.
that the emphasis is on all Hindus, and that is the most important. You're Hindu first, and everything else second. That is more the RSS position. Um, but I cannot, claim to speak for the RSS or anybody like that. You can't second guess any political entity, but simply looking at it in terms of, it's clearly a very uh, core dilemma for the current regime, where their main plank has been Hindu identity, and aggressive Hindu identity at that. And Caste is obviously diametrically opposed to that. And this is the central um, seesaw battle that is being played out and which will be decisive for the future of our country. If the politics of Hindutva genuinely overcomes caste, then it will be a hegemonic and impossible to beat ideology. But on the other hand, the very spirit of Hindutva and its core supporters rely on a sense of social hierarchy, their own sense of self identity for the large sections of upper castes who are the core constituency of this regime. Uh, their own sense of self identity is invested in the social distance that they believe separates them from other castes. So, undermining that social distance in anything except purely cosmetic ways will, I believe, be unacceptable. So this is the central issue. And if you have a leader charismatic enough, a kind of Gandhi in reverse, if you wish, um, who would persuade this constituency to overcome their sense of abhorrence of genuine equality, then it will be a revolutionary moment. Nothing short of a revolutionary moment. But the probability of that is very low because there is a very deep sense of investment in social distance, in a sense of high and low, and so on. So this is this is the future of a country is decided by essentially this question, to my mind, whether the politics of caste is able to make inroads in the politics of Hindutva, or the other way around. The politics of Hindutva blunts the politics of caste. I do believe that the question you have raised is a very central question, and it is a decisive question for the immediate future of our country. And that is the standoff, or the tension between the politics of caste and the politics of Hindutva, or the politics of Hindu identity. And we have to see whether the politics of caste is able to, in a sense, make inroads in the politics of Hindutva and able to modify Hindutva to make it more palatable, make it more socially acceptable to large sections, or the other way around, that the politics of Hindutva is able to blunt the caste-based mobilizations and take them over or subsume them. Um, this is not it's not an easy thing to predict. Uh, we know that there are very caste is a very deep thing, and Hindutva is currently extremely powerful and on the ascendant. So it's not a foregone conclusion as to what will happen. But the chances are that the politics of caste supremacy will continue to reign. That is my guess, but because that is
But
the
by
way.
politics of
Very,
caste supremacy, you mean Hindutva.
yes, yes, I do mean that, because in the end, that is where the way for the politics of Hindutva to develop itself is to mute its caste angle while highlighting the Hindu angle. That's why you need enemies. That's why you need others. That's why you need people to blame, and so on. And the search for such others or enemies is always on, whether it's minorities or whether it's urban Naxals, or enemies within, and so on. This has been typical, historically very typical of regimes of this sort, where you need an external enemy, and the best enemy is an internal enemy. The Someone from inside who you are able to externalize. You have to make an outsider, someone, and the intimate outsider. The person intimately, but you have to be. But these are all abstractions. We don't know, in terms of the real politics, what will happen. Broadly speaking, the idealistic politics of caste, encapsulated by Baba Sahib's term annihilation of caste, was articulated in the pre-electoral politics era in the 1930s. This is the talk of the 1930s. Today, we need to think afresh after 7 decades of electoral politics and the rise of Hindutva. We need to think afresh what concretely might be meant by the annihilation of caste. And I think we need to take a very hard look at this, because the simplistic ideas of annihilation call to mind some kind of erasure. And you can't simply erase an institution like caste, which has been around for centuries. The only way in which caste can be effectively annihilated is if some other force comes to overwrite it. So it is never erased, but it is overwritten. And in fact, our history, our social history, is a series of such overwritings. When something new comes along, and Bhakti movement came and overwrote something, then caste reasserted itself, etc., etc. So what will do that overwriting? Currently, Hindutva is doing that overwriting, but it need not be the only candidate. There can be other candidates, and that is what we have.
Modernity was supposed to do that overriding.
Yes, yes, but modernity, we underestimated the resilience of our social systems. So, and caste is an excellent example, because caste has, in a sense, domesticated modernity. Caste has domesticated capitalism. In our country, Indian capitalism, Indian modernity are contained in caste. Caste contains them, not the other way around. And even Hinduism, caste contains Hinduism, not the other way around. So caste is a formidable thing in our context, and it will require a formidable effort to genuinely overwrite it with something else. But that is our hope. We have to think of annihilation in those terms, not in the sense that tomorrow caste will vanish. Or we saw the folly, the utter folly and naivety of that in the Nehru era. Stopping to talk about caste does not mean it will go away. You have to address what allows it to reproduce itself. And what allows it to reproduce itself is its ability to reproduce privilege and systematically reproduce privilege and disprivilege in particular groups. There is some leakage, yes. There's leakage, and all the argument by anecdote that people have about how caste is withering away is from these kinds of anecdotes. My third cousin's friend is such and such low caste, but he's a millionaire. These kinds of argument by anecdote. If you look at the macro numbers, the macro numbers tell you a very stark story. The caste system is alive and well and flourishing in terms of its ability to reproduce itself. We need to disturb that ability. We need to find a force that will disturb that ability. And that is what we are looking for. Currently, Hindutva is offering itself as a force, at least on the surface. But at the heart of Hindutva is that caste itself. So it looks like a contradiction. It is a contradiction. Do we have a leader who will transcend this contradiction in some way through sheer charisma? Do we have social forces? If not a charismatic leader, do we have social movements that can provide an alternative way of overwriting the narrative of caste?
Right. I think it might be fair to say that the politics of caste, and the politics of Hindutva have been the two poles driving electoral politics in India for quite some time now. And perhaps the caste census is the latest chapter in the confrontation between Kamandal and Mandal, so to speak, as they say. And we'll have to wait and watch how this latest dynamic plays itself out. Thank you so much once again, Professor Deshpande, for joining us in this conversation. It was really nice and really insightful to listen to you. Pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.